Hi everybody, this is Amy Nunnally here, and we are going to continue our discussion today on cells. We spent a lot of time in the last couple of sections talking about chemistry and talking about the chemical compounds in our body. Remember, the four major chemical compounds that we talked about were the proteins, they were lipids, they were carbohydrates, and they were nucleic acids. We also talked a good bit about water and ions. And now in this chapter we're going to put all of those together to create larger structures called organelles, and the organelles which then become our body cells. So let's jump into this discussion. The basic cell structure you may be familiar with is in this diagram. This outer membrane here that creates the border of the cell is called the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. Do you remember which of the four major compounds created the plasma membrane? Those were the phospholipids, which were in the category of lipids, which are fats in our body. So the cell membrane or the plasma membrane makes up the outer border. Inside the cell is an organelle typically located in the central region, but not always, and this is the nucleus. The nucleus contains the DNA, which is the genetic code for our body. Remember, so we have the DNA there. Inside the nucleus, and the plasma membrane is what makes up the border. Now, let me show you really quick another thing. This plasma membrane is going to divide two areas of fluid. The fluid inside the cell is called cytoplasm. This is the inner fluid, or intracellular fluid. The fluid out here is called the extracellular fluid. You might have heard it called interstitial fluid, but the extracellular fluid is what bathes the outside of the cell. It is outside of the plasma membrane, the cytoplasm is inside of the plasma membrane, and the membrane itself forms the border and really regulates passage in and out of the cell. So let's jump ahead. In this figure, just another reminder of where the nucleus is located and that it contains the DNA. Remember, that's a really important part of what's going on in our cells. And out here in this area of cytoplasm, which is between the nucleus and the plasma membrane, you have a lot of organelles that are suspended in that fluid, and each of these organelles is a little factory of some sort that's responsible for a major function of the cell. If you look at this figure, if you have this figure in your book, this is a list of the major organelles in our body's cells, and the ones that are circled here are the ones that you need to know for this class. Feel free to read more about the others. They are certainly important, but these are the most important for what we will be talking about. I'll go through a quick description of the organelles that were listed on that chart. Let's start here with the ribosomes. The ribosomes are these little circular organelles, little tiny things. Some of them are floating freely in the cytoplasm. Most of them are attached to the endoplasmic reticulum, another organelle network inside the cell. But whether they are free or whether they are attached to the endoplasmic reticulum, let me show you the job of the ribosome. The job of the ribosome is to read the RNA and make the protein. So I think we mentioned earlier that there's a basic flow of DNA to RNA to protein. And remember that a protein is simply a chain of amino acids. And the order, or the particular amino acids that get added to that chain at any given time, is determined completely by the genetic code found in the DNA. Now, do you remember why we need RNA to begin with? Well, if you remember, we have our cell here, In the nucleus, we have the DNA. The protein gets made out here in the cytoplasm, and we can't get the genetic code out to the cytoplasm without first creating an RNA copy. The RNA is what's able to move out into the cytoplasm, and here it's where it gets attached to these ribosomes. The ribosomes read that RNA copy, and they start to create a chain of amino acids based on that genetic code that then get folded up to become all the different proteins that we need in our cells. So that's the job of the ribosome. Mitochondria, these are organelles that you'll see floating around in the cytoplasm as well. These are mitochondria. And the job of the mitochondria is to make ATP. Now, here's another question. Do you remember what the ATP was for? Hopefully you do. ATP was the major source of energy in our body cells. Remember, we have adenosine with 3 phosphate groups attached. And these phosphate groups have what type of charge? They have a highly negative charge, remember? And those phosphate groups want nothing but to repel each other. And because of that, the chemical bonds between those phosphate groups have to be very strong. So when a cell is able to break apart that ATP into ADP, meaning 2 phosphates, plus a single phosphate, plus energy. And then the cell can use that energy to do work. But in order to do that, we have to first create the ATP so that our cells have access to it. And the mitochondria are the organelles responsible for making ATP. Okay, a few other particular organelles or structures that I'd like to talk about. This one is called cilia. Cilia are just these little bitty hairs that are found on the exposed surface of some of our cells. The job of cilia, just like you see in this picture below, is to really wave or to move in one direction. What it does is that it creates a current in the fluid that's passing above it, and these cilia wave and make the fluid move. Well, that can be really helpful in lots of different scenarios. One of the most important is in your respiratory tract. So deep inside your respiratory tract, as it enters into the lungs, there are cilia that are lining this space. And the cilia are constantly moving fluid, like mucus, upwards. So anything that gets stuck in the cilia, anything that makes its way into your respiratory tract, ends up getting moved upwards so that you can cough it out or swallow it and get rid of it, and it keeps your lungs clean. Another time that this is really important is in the fallopian tubes of the female uterus, outside of the uterus. There's one here, and here's the other. Well, the egg gets released from the ovary, and it makes its way into the fallopian tube. Well, the fallopian tube is lined with these little cilia, and what it does is that it creates a current that pulls that egg or transports that egg all the way down into the uterus so implantation can occur. Excuse me. So that's the job of cilia. Flagella, another reproductive example for you. Flagella, or a flagellum, is a single structure that's found on particular cells. This is an example of a sperm that has a long flagellum on it. The flagellum allows this cell to swim. It has lots and lots of mitochondria in it that give it lots of energy, and so it can make its way through the female reproductive tract until it finds the egg where it can attach to the egg. So the flagellum, as far as we are concerned, is specific to the sperm, and we'll get to that later in the reproductive chapter. One more structure it's actually listed here with all of the organelles, but it's not quite an organelle. It's not not in the same way at least. The microvilli is actually a modification of the plasma membrane itself. So let's say that this is a basic structure of a cell. Well, every now and then the cells have a plasma membrane that looks like this on the outer surface. So that phospholipid bilayer creates this ruffled look on one side. What does that do for the plasma membrane? Basically what it does is that it increases the surface area. It gives you more space. If you take the length of that plasma membrane compared to this one, so this would be the length of that plasma membrane, well, if you stretch this one out, it might be this long. So if you have transport happening across that plasma membrane, you have a lot more space for this transport to occur. And that's a really important thing, especially in places like the digestive tract, where you have absorption of nutrients happening. We'll have other examples of this as well, but that's a good place to start. So the microvilli are a modification of the membrane itself. They're not sitting on top of a cell like the cilia are, but they are actually a part of it. All right. At the last section of this video, I want to just remind us about the structure of the plasma membrane. Remember, we said that the plasma membrane was made of phospholipids. They form a double layer, and that is the boundary between the extracellular fluid and the cytoplasm on the inside, right? Well, this phospholipid bilayer, remember, is made up of phospholipids that have a polar head and nonpolar tails. Remember, the nonpolar tails are hydrophobic. That means that they are water fearing, so they're going to tuck inwards. They're going to hide from the water. The polar heads are hydrophilic, so they are water loving. So the heads, both on the outer surface and on the inner surface, are completely happy interacting with the water. It's the tails that want to hide from the water. So they spontaneously form this double layer that helps the tails, both sets of tails, completely avoid the water, which is how they prefer to be. If you need to remember that discussion that we had about oil and water, that was that example where the oil and the water don't mix. You'll have the oil on top and the water below because the oil is completely hydrophobic and it wants to stay as far away as possible from the water. All right, we'll stop there and we'll continue with more discussion about the membrane next. Thanks.